The epic hour-long collab I did with 6 other creators covered every aspect of Rowling's TERF. Or so I thought. Nope, JK Rightwing added her name to a nebulous open letter that appears to condemn cancel culture, but is, in actuality, a remarkable piece of propaganda that both enrages and astounds me. In other words, as an author, I've got some thoughts to share, so here we are. Kairate! Most of my content has been polytheism oriented with a lefty bent, and I plan on doing more political content in the future, so I hope you enjoy it. When one of my audience members sent me the Harper's letter, I hesitated because I wasn't sure that I had anything to add to the conversation that hadn't already been said, and probably better than I could. Until a friend of mine pointed out that my skills as a writer are useful for showing folks how manipulative propaganda, even as short as 3 paragraphs, can get fence-sitters to nod their head along with ideas that, put more succinctly, they would never agree with. I'm gonna point out where she's wrong too, but my main focus is taking a detailed look at how the craft of this letter, which according to an article by NPR was actually penned by Thomas Chatterton, has been used to deceive. Critical thinking is important to both sides of my audience, atheist and polytheist, so it's important to showcase ways you can critically look at crap like this, and maybe even how you can point out these techniques in those you follow. The letter is in the description below if you'd like to open it up and follow along. The structure of this video is a bit different than the collab in the sense that I'm going to be going through the piece systematically for the elements of propaganda rather than reading it sequentially and commenting on it, so you might want to read it first before we get too much deeper in. Okay, so to start, we need to actually define propaganda. According to Edward Bernays in his book Propaganda, propaganda is the mechanism by which ideas are disseminated on a large scale, in the broad sense of an organized effort to spread a particular belief or doctrine. In the opening chapters, he argues that propaganda isn't necessarily a negative thing and that many branches of the government are engaged with it, which I guess as an anarchist I don't necessarily think makes it not a bad thing, but we use it too, so whatever. The purpose, he argues, is to shift public opinion by means of controlling, disseminating, and reframing information. We engage with propaganda constantly. News headlines are often a form of propaganda, as are the articles themselves. We'll get into how that works later, but suffice to say, calling something propaganda doesn't make it evil, though I'd argue the cause this letter supports definitely is. The book is a fantastic read on the theoretical and practical expressions of propaganda at the time, but to get a systematic model that I could use to analyze this particular piece, I needed to turn to another book, The 10 Commandments of Propaganda by Brian Anse Patrick. One caveat before we get started, Patrick is a far-right propagandist himself, however that's part of what makes him an expert on the subject, alongside his PhD in communication and his tenured work on the topic at Toledo before his death in 2016. Would not recommend anything else from him or his publisher, but this was the most comprehensive source I've found on the application and identification of propagandistic techniques. As such, I'll be using it as a model for the rest of this video. The first commandment of propaganda, according to Patrick, is control the flow of information, which he argues is done in 2 basic ways. The first is by becoming a source or distributor of information, and the second is by excluding undesirable or contrary information. Let's take a look at how the letter does this. First, the authors chose to publish it in an open format in Harper's, using the names of over 150 signatories with prominent places in the community to back the letter's authenticity and importance. These thought leaders may give a potential critic pause. Why is Noam Chomsky signing something that people are calling anti-trans propaganda? Rowling herself being on here helps create a backlash loop at other press outlets, which increases exposure due to response. In terms of eliminating undesirable or conflicting information, this is done primarily in the second paragraph. As an author, one of the things I learned early on is that long paragraphs like this are tiring to the eyes, as are long sentences. Mystery writers actually like to hide clues that will be important later in the middle of long lists, as people are more likely to remember the first and last things they read. This structure will become more important later in the video when we talk about the inverted funnel structure of argumentation, but for right now, just note how dang long and wordy this paragraph is, and note the location of the examples they use to illustrate their point. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces, books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity, journalists are barred from writing on certain topics, professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class, a researcher is fired for circulating peer-reviewed academic studies, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. That's a lot of examples, but know what's missing. Any names or details that we could use to find them. In fact, there's even a cheeky nod to how aware they are of the exclusion right there in the next sentence. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. They outright tell us not to go look up the stories. Why? Well, that's the principle of exclusion that we just talked about. They obfuscate the details and assure us that they're not actually important, because if we saw the details, maybe a pattern would emerge. And intellectual laziness is a trait found in most readers, whether we like admitting so or not. How often do you go personally digging into claims you don't have strong feelings on? We're looking at fence-sitters as a primary audience here, not activists. They know we already don't agree with them. It's your centrist aunt, uncle, or cousin that they're targeting, and by the end of this big long monster paragraph filled with vague platitudes, bookended as we'll examine later by common values of folks in this audience, they're not likely to go down a Google rabbit hole to find these specific examples. Well, guess what? I'm not your centrist aunt, so let's shine some light here and see if we can find a pattern. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. This one was actually pretty easy to find. It most likely refers to John Caldera, former columnist for the Denver Post, who posted a massive screed on public Facebook about how his last column insisting that there were only two sexes got him fired over what he termed political correctness. I mean, if getting fired over stating medically inaccurate information in a publication and being a dick to trans people is being fired over political correctness, I guess he's right. I mean, press X to doubt. The column criticized an education bill that included trans health in the program for sex ed. So yeah, let that sink in for a second. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity appears to refer to the book The Lost Boys of Bird Island being withdrawn for sloppy journalism against a still reprehensible apartheid regime. Note, by noting this, I'm not saying that I support the apartheid regime in question. Specifically though, the same-gender assault of young children by the leaders of said regime was the topic of the book. Reviews allege that the policeman used in the book as a primary source botched the investigation so badly that it's impossible to determine what really happened, and eventually the backlash built up so much that the publisher withdrew the book. I don't see what this has to do with so-called cancel culture. I mean, unless you think that somehow it was the pro-LGBT rights people that had a problem with it, but like this was exposing a problem. Clearly, there was another reason for it to be withdrawn. Next, journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. That was a little harder to track down. I did find one piece about the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette barring Alexis Johnson from covering BLM protests because she posted a satirical tweet about the protests mocking the prevailing narratives about looting, and the paper decided she couldn't report fairly on it. Which, yeah, I agree, that's BS, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with cancel culture. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class probably refers to a UCLA professor who repeatedly used the N slur in class while quoting MLK, even when requested repeatedly to stop by uncomfortable students. The students filed a formal complaint with the institution, and the professor was fired. Doesn't seem like such a simply unjust issue when you put it that way, does it? A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, likely refers to Michigan State University ousting Steven Hsu for publishing and circulating research about genetic differences in IQ between racial groups. Specifically, it was for a number of comments regarding selecting embryos based on potential intelligence, which smacks of eugenics. The calls weren't even to fire him, they were to demote him as head of research just to faculty. And this comes after a history of negative comments on race, gender, and eugenics. It came to a head in June, so it's not as though this wasn't unprecedented. Heads of organizations are ousted for making clumsy mistakes is the only one I couldn't find a clear-cut single example for, but as you can see, there's a pretty clear pattern here. People in power do crappy things that can harm members of their communities, there are consequences, and they cry, "Cancel culture, help!" Tell me, how many of your friends and family would have gone and done all the digging just to verify the information in a single sentence? Yet, here we have a picture of anti-trans and anti-minority folks howling about the consequences for their actions. Seems legit. Which brings us to the second commandment of propaganda, which is to reflect the values and beliefs of the audience. The idea here is to use platitudes just vague enough to mean what your target audience wants them to, creating an association between these things and the values that would spark an emotional reaction. This letter is packed with examples of this technique, but let's look at three of the most prominent. The title itself, A Letter on Justice and Open Debate, immediately conjures to mind two values often taken for granted in American society. But what does justice mean here? Was justice not served in the above examples of transphobic, homophobic, and racist actions by folks in power? Or is it unjust for consequences to exist for bigoted behavior? Open debate is an interesting concept as well, given that nowhere is it the government restricting discussion. Instead, the court of public opinion, also known as the marketplace of ideas, has judged these actions and attitudes to be worthy of punishment up to and including termination in the workplace. The authors cry foul because they don't like that this has occurred, but insisting the debate isn't over just because you've lost seems a little disingenuous, doesn't it? In the opening paragraph, we also get a strong conflation of perceived values among centrist readers in the form of a couplet refutation structure. The first two sentences appeal to proposed support for ending injustice, then the but puts a halt and causes the reader to question the support in its expression. The next couplet reminds the reader that their support shouldn't be taken too far and appeals particularly to distaste for Donald Trump as a way to tie these ideas together in the mind of the reader. Then the next but comes barging in, assuring us that resistance can't become what they perceive as dogma and coercion, again appealing to the idea that right-wing demagogues are already doing this. Nope, we can't allow people to be publicly intolerant because those people you don't like do that, and you don't want to be like them, do you? These ideas are married in the reader's mind before they even move on to the arguments. The third example is in the conclusion. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. What causes are those exactly? Because at the top of the page, the authors supported the BLM protests and police reform, but nowhere in here has that been harmed. Several of the signatories are out-and-out TERFs, the most prominent of which is Rowling, and their causes perhaps have been harmed by condemnation of anti-trans rhetoric, but is hurting and dehumanizing trans people the most vital cause of our time? I suppose it is to them, but to your centrist aunt, maybe not. Which brings us to Commandment 3, disambiguate. Propaganda, according to Patrick, doesn't work if shades of gray exist. Instead, it's best to set up stark black and white lines. In this case, the courageous free speech warriors in the form of the authors and editors who dare to express edgy opinions against the slobbering masses who don't want to be dehumanized. We see this most strongly in the opening and closing paragraphs. Strong, action-oriented language tells us our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial, but this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength, but resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or conformity. The restriction of debate invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. Heady words, but as I illustrated above with those examples, it's clear this dichotomy is being carefully constructed to manipulate and appeal to the values of the readers. By associating justice and freedom and open debate with no consequences for bigotry, we're getting a rightward shift towards public toleration of abusive practices by those in power in the name of quote-unquote freedom. Freedom for who, though? That's the question they never answer. Commandment 4, use group pressure to horizontally shape beliefs and behavior. This I covered a little bit earlier. The signatories themselves, particularly Margaret Atwood, Noam Chomsky, and J.K. Rowling, create an internal conflict in many readers. Some of these people have done great things for feminism or free speech, and one wrote a book that many people fell in love with growing up. How could this letter be so heinous if they agree with it? Shut down the critical thinking facilities, ignore the red flags, don't look up the examples, not along. The fifth commandment, cognitively penetrate and stick, requires a little bit more explanation. The brevity of the letter itself, along with the decisiveness of the opening and closing language, makes it an easy breakfast table or opinion piece talking point for the average person. Those vague platitudes we just went over create striking associations in the minds of fence-sitters, now Frenchly convinced by the rhetoric, to spread their message and reject any new detail shed by opinion pieces. The confirmation bias sets in because any criticism of the letter is now an ambiguous they that is trying to shut down the conversation. It creates a feedback loop and keeps the piece on the mind while stifling critical consideration of it. The sixth commandment, distance the propaganda from its source, is also pretty easy to address. Having over 150 signatories and publishing in a news outlet unrelated to most of them sure does that, doesn't it? It took me quite a while to figure out who penned the majority of the piece, and according to the New York Times, it may have even been a group rather than just one man. J.K. Rowling's name also means a lot of the discussion surrounds her, even though she had little to do with the drafting of the letter as far as I can tell from any sources. The mass makes holding any individual accountable near impossible. The seventh commandment, accommodate informational needs and habits, is pretty easy to cover as well. It was published online in an open letter format, not locked behind a paywall or anything. It's relatively short at only 3 paragraphs long and packed with argument without much substance to back it, but the appearance of fairness with nods to Donald Trump being a jerk hides the mostly prominent criticism of the left. It's easily digestible, easily found, and associated with big names that cause it to come up in search results at the top. Commandment 8, address psychological, social, and spiritual needs. Who doesn't need to feel heard? The entire premise of this letter is that, should cancel culture as the authors conceive it continue, no one will be. It paints minorities as the true power and the poor elite as oppressed by the throngs of culture, and then draws a kinship between those elites and the reader with lines like, as writers, we need a culture that leaves room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. Hear that, reader? If you disagree with your boss on whether or not your coworker is a human deserving of equal rights, you could be fired! Oh, the horror! Of course, with all that obfuscation of details surrounding their examples, that direct correlation isn't actually drawn by our poor reader. No, it's if you disagree with someone about something political, you're screwed, as though those two things are the same. The balance of power is utterly ignored here, which is where we get to the reverse pyramid funnel. The article opens with its thesis: the democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that is set in on all sides, and builds from there. Your aunt's mind is already set on this idea from the outset, and everything that comes after merely cements it further, rather than building the arguments and presenting the conclusion as would be in typical persuasive dialogue. The conclusion is already there and simply reiterated at the end, shakily supported by platitudes, but strong enough for your aunt. Commandment 9. Personalize and dehumanize as appropriate. This is a tough one, but hear me out. The faceless masses of those who disagree with the writers are dehumanized indirectly, in that they're never actually spoken of beyond mentioning that institutional leaders in a spirit of panic damage control deliver hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms, in response to quote-unquote their demands. The leaders themselves, also stripped of their names, are judged from the outset as unreasonable without any investigation of the individual cases presented, which we did above. But the quote-unquote we, the reasonable people reading this article, are, quote, already paying the price in greater risk aversion. Never mind that we're talking primarily about millionaires who can hardly relate to most of the people reading here. Quote-unquote we disagree with quote-unquote them. We is used throughout the piece to humanize those fighting against consequences for blatant bigotry, while vague terms like, quote, leaders and, quote, public opinion are used against their opponents. We're not human, we're just, quote, they. The last commandment, dispense truth, facts, logic, and science, is deliberately avoided in this piece. What is asserted as fact, as examined above, is ultimately a curtain meant to hide the workings of the wizard from the reader. Pay no attention to the facts and details behind the curtain, or the argument is exposed for what it is. Talk about Rowling as a TERF and not the larger pro-bigotry argument being made here. This whole piece is ultimately the so-called paradox of tolerance in exposited form, and badly presented at that, as the paradox is easily solved when we realize that only by refusal to tolerate dehumanizing views can such views perish, and only when social consequences are enacted for intolerance can something resembling equality exist. And the persuasiveness of arguments like this relies on the reader's desire not to dig deeper, to be vindicated emotionally by the perceived slights against them and their loved ones related to social consequence. Those of us who have been on the receiving end of intolerance, who have experienced hate our whole lives, know the truth, that only recently has consequence even existed for those in power, and that this letter is their rallying cry to the rest of us to lay up. I hope this showcases how centrists can be so easily manipulated by just a few short paragraphs, and how deep that manipulation goes. Phew, as an author, this annoyed the heck out of me, even though I really admire the level of craft that went into something this manipulative, and it took pages to explain just how far the rabbit hole went with it. If you're new here, punt the subscribe button and heat the bell up until it cracks like the Liberty Bell in Philly. Maybe hit the like button while you're at it. Drop me a comment if you learned something, or just want to tell me to fuck off and make you a sandwich if that's your gig. Special thanks to GaelicNox for their awesome artwork, links to their Twitter and website in the description as always. And remember, we're stronger together.